3. Such was the first course of lessons given to Russian citizens in the School of Representative Institutions opened by the Ministry of the Interior. Fortunately, in addition to the political scholars who, in connection with the constitutional declarations of the 60s, wrote that it is time to give up all nonsense and get down to business, and business is now in the Zemstvo institutions and nowhere else. 12. There were in Russia also hotheads who were not satisfied with such tact and went with revolutionary propaganda among the people. Although they adhered to a theory which in essence was not revolutionary, their propaganda roused a spirit of discontent and protest among broad strata of the educated youth. Despite their utopian theory, which rejected political struggle, the movement led to a desperate grapple between the government and a handful of heroes, to a struggle for political freedom. Thanks to this struggle, and to it alone, the situation again changed. The government was once more compelled to make concessions, and the liberals once again revealed their political immaturity, their inability to support the fighters and bring real pressure to bear upon the government. The constitutional aspirations of the Zemstvo became very marked, but these proved to be but a feeble impulse, despite the fact that Zemstvo liberalism in itself had made decided political progress. Particularly noteworthy was its attempt to establish an illegal party and to set up its own political organ. In his memorandum, Witte summarizes some of these illegal writings, of Canon, Dragomanov, Tikhomirov, in order to demonstrate the slippery path p. 98 upon which the Zemstvo had entered. In the late 70s, several congresses of Zemstvo liberals were held. The liberals decided to take measures to bring about at least a temporary cessation of the destructive activities of the extreme revolutionary party, for they were convinced that nothing could be achieved by peaceful means if the terrorists continued to irritate and alarm the government by threats and acts of violence p. 99. Thus, instead of making an effort to extend the struggle, to secure considerable public support for individual revolutionaries, to organize some sort of public pressure, in the form of demonstrations, of refusal by the Zemstvo to carry out compulsory expenditures, etc., the liberals again appealed for tact, not to irritate the government, to employ the peaceful means that had so brilliantly proved their futility in the 60s. 13. Of course, the revolutionaries refused to agree to any cessation or suspension of fighting actions. The Zemstvo supporters then formed the League of Oppositional Elements, which was later transformed into the Zemstvo Union and Self-Government Society, or Zemstvo Union. The program of the Zemstvo Union contained the following demands: 1. Freedom of speech and the press, 2. Inviolability of the person, and 3. The convocation of a constituent assembly. An attempt to publish illegal pamphlets in Galicia failed. The Austrian police seized the manuscripts and the persons who intended to print them, and in August 1881 Volnoy Slovo, 37, edited in Geneva by Dragomanov, professor of Kiev University, became the official organ of the Zemstvo Union. In the final analysis, wrote Dragomanov in 1888, the attempt to publish Volnoy Slovo as a Zemstvo organ cannot be regarded as successful, if only for the reason that Zemstvo material did not begin to reach the editorial office regularly until late in 1882 and publication ceased in May 1883, op. Cit. p. 40. The failure of the liberal organ was a natural effect of the weakness of the liberal movement. On November 20, 1878, Alexander II delivered a speech at a meeting of representatives of the social estates in Moscow, in which he expressed the hope that he would obtain their cooperation in checking the erring younger generation which was pursuing the fatal path whither suspect persons were striving to lead it. Later, an appeal for public cooperation appeared in Pravitelstvenny Vestnik, 38, number 186, 1878. In reply, 5 Zemstvo assemblies, Kharkov, Poltava, Chernigov, Samara, and Tver, issued declarations urging the need to convene a National Assembly. We may believe also, says Witte in his memorandum, after summarizing in detail the contents of these petitions, of which only 3 appeared in the press in full, that the Zemstvo declarations on the convocation of a National Assembly would have been far more numerous, had not the Ministry of the Interior taken timely steps to prevent such declarations. The marshals of the nobility, as chairman of gubernia Zemstvo assemblies, received circular letters instructing them to prevent even the reading of such petitions at meetings of the assemblies. In some places, arrests were made and councillors banished. In Chernigov the meeting hall was invaded and forcibly cleared by gendarmes. p. 104. The liberal magazines and newspapers supported the movement. A petition signed by 25 prominent Moscow citizens addressed to Loris Melikov asked for the convocation of an independent assembly of representatives of the Zemstvos which should be given the right to participate in the government of the nation. In appointing Loris Melikov Minister of the Interior, the government was apparently making a concession. But only apparently. For not only were no decisive steps taken, there were not even any declarations that might be called positive and incapable of misinterpretation. Loris Melikov called together the editors of St. Petersburg periodicals and explained to them the program, to learn the wishes, needs, etc., of the population, to enable the Zemstvos, etc., to enjoy their legal rights. The liberal program guarantees the Zemstvos those rights of which the law systematically deprives them, etc. The author of the memorandum states, through the medium of these interlocutors the minister's program was circulated throughout Russia, for which purpose they had been called together. In point of fact, the program did not promise anything definite. One could read into it anything one desired, i.e., everything or nothing. A leaflet secretly distributed at the time was right in its way, only in its way, not absolutely in every way. When it stated that the program simultaneously wagged a fox tail and gnashed wolf's fangs, this attack on the program and its author is the more understandable, because, in communicating the program to the representatives of the press, the Count strongly urged them not to confuse and not to excite the public mind needlessly with their visionary illusions, but the liberal Zemstvo supporters refused to listen to the truth contained in the secret leaflet and accepted the wagging of the foxtail as a new policy worthy of confidence. The Zemstvos believed and sympathized with the government, says the memorandum, quoting an illegally published pamphlet, the opinions of the Zemstvo assemblies on the present state of Russia, and they seemed afraid of running too far ahead and of pestering the government with excessive requests, a characteristic admission on the part of the Zemstvo adherents, who enjoyed freedom of expression. The Zemstvo Union at its Congress in 1880 had only just decided to strive to secure central popular representation, of which an absolute condition would be a single chamber and universal suffrage. When this decision to strive to secure it was carried out by the tactic of refraining from running too far ahead and believing and sympathizing with ambiguous declarations that bind no one to anything, with unpardonable naivete, the Zemstvo adherents imagined that presenting petitions meant striving to secure, and petitions poured in from the Zemstvos in abundance. On January 28, 1881, Loris Melikov submitted the most humble memorial to the Tsar proposing the establishment of a commission of Zemstvo representatives with advisory powers only, for the purpose of drafting the laws His Majesty would be pleased to indicate. The special council set up by Alexander II approved of this measure. The findings of the council of February 17, 1881, were confirmed by the Tsar, who also approved the text of the government announcement submitted by Loris Melikov. Undoubtedly, writes Witte, the establishment of such a purely advisory commission did not yet establish a constitution, but, he continues, it can hardly be denied that it represented a step forward, following the reforms of the Six Ties towards a constitution and towards nothing else. The author then repeats a statement contained in the foreign press to the effect that upon reading Loris Melikov's memorial, Alexander II exclaimed, "Why, this is the Etats Generale, What is proposed to us is neither more nor less than the Assembly of Notables of Louis XVI 39. We would observe, on our part, that under certain circumstances the application of Loris Milikov's proposal might have been a step towards a constitution, but it might also not have been. Everything depended on which prevailed: the pressure of the Revolutionary Party and the liberal public, or the counter-pressure of the very powerful, compact party of persisting supporters of the autocracy that were unscrupulous in the methods they employed. If, however, we speak, not of what might have happened, but of what actually did happen, then we must admit the indubitable fact that the government was wavering. Some members of the government were in favor of strenuously resisting the liberals, while others were in favor of making concessions. But, and this is particularly important, even the latter wavered, having no very definite program and never rising above the level of scheming bureaucrats. In his memorandum, Witte writes, Count Loris Milikov appeared to be afraid to look the affair straight in the face and to define his program with precision. He continued the evasive policy, in another direction, it is true, that had been adopted by Count Volyaev towards the Zemstvo institutions. As even the legal press rightly pointed out at the time, the program announced by Loris Milikov was distinguished by its extreme vagueness. This vagueness is observed in all the Count's subsequent actions and pronouncements. On the one hand, he declared that the autocracy was separated from the people, that he looks to public support as the principal force, and that he regarded the proposed reform not as something final, but merely as a first step, etc. On the other hand, the Count declared at the same time to the press representatives that the hopes aroused among the people are nothing but a visionary illusion, and in his most humble memorial to the Tsar, he stated categorically that a National Assembly would be a dangerous experiment of reverting to the past, that the measure he proposed would not in any way restrict the powers of the autocracy, since it had nothing in common with Western constitutional forms. Generally speaking, as L. Tikhomirov has fitly remarked, the memorial itself is distinguished by its wonderfully confused wording p. 117. In his attitude towards the freedom fighters, Loris Milikov, that notorious hero of the dictatorship of the heart, 40, displayed a cruelty unparalleled, before or since, in ordering the execution of a 17-year-old youth for a printed leaflet found in his possession. Loris Milikov did not forget the most remote parts of Siberia, and he did everything to worsen the conditions of the exiles suffering for their propaganda. Visa Silicon Social Democrat, 41 No. 1, p. 84. In view of the government's wavering, only a force capable of earnest struggle could have secured a constitution, but such a force was lacking. The revolutionaries had exhausted themselves by their effort of March 1, 42. There was neither a broad movement nor a strong organization of the working class, and the liberal public on this occasion again proved to be so politically immature that even after the assassination of Alexander II it restricted itself to the mere presentation of petitions. The Zemstvos, the municipalities, and the liberal press, Poryadok, Strana, Golas, 14, all presented petitions. Particularly loyal, artful, and nebulous were the petitions of the liberal authors of memoranda, such as the Marquis of Velopolsky, Professor Shikarin, and Professor Gordovsky. Witti's memorandum reproduces their content from a pamphlet published in London. 15. The Constitution of Count Loris Milikov, Free Russian Press Fund, London, 1893. Those authors invented ingenious devices for bringing the monarch to cross the Rubicon without his being aware of it. It stands to reason that all these cautious petitions and artful devices proved utterly useless without a revolutionary force, and the autocratic party triumphed despite the fact that on March 8, 1881, a majority of the Council of Ministers, 7 against 5, had voted in favor of Loris Milikov's proposal. So the pamphlet has it. But Witte, who assiduously cites its authors, for some reason or other declares in his memorandum, It is not authentically known what happened at this meeting of March 8 and what it resulted in. It would be rash to rely upon the rumors that have reached the foreign press. p. 124. On April 29, 1881, the Manifesto on the Reaffirmation and Preservation of Autocracy, described by Katkov as "manna from heaven," was promulgated. For the second time since the emancipation of the peasants, the revolutionary tide was swept back, and following it and as a consequence of it, the liberal movement for a second time gave way to reaction, over which Russian progressive society, of course, raised bitter lamentations. We are past masters of the art of lamentation. We lament the tactlessness and self-assurance of revolutionaries in harassing the government. We lament the government's indecisiveness when, finding that it is not confronted by a real force, it makes pseudo-concessions and takes back with one hand what it has given with the other. We lament the age without ideas and ideals, when the government, having settled scores with revolutionaries whom the people failed to support, hastens to make up for lost time and fortifies itself for a fresh onslaught. IV. The epoch of the dictatorship of the heart, as Loris Melikov's ministry has been described, proved to our liberals that even the constitutionalism of one of the ministers, even of the prime minister, with the government wavering and the council of ministers approving, the first step towards reform by a majority, still guarantees precisely nothing, if there is no serious social force capable of compelling the government to surrender. It is interesting to note also that the government of Alexander III did not show its fangs immediately upon the promulgation of the manifesto reaffirming the autocracy, but found it necessary for a time to fool the public. In employing the term, fool the public, we do not suggest that the government adopted the Machiavellian scheme of some minister, notable, or other. It cannot be overemphasized that the system of pseudo-concessions and of seemingly important steps to meet public opinion has become an integral part of the policy of every modern government, including the Russian, for the Russian government has for many generations recognized the necessity of reckoning with public opinion in one way or another, and in the course of many generations has trained statesmen in the shrewd art of domestic diplomacy. Such a diplomat was Count Ignatieff, whose appointment to the Ministry of the Interior in place of Loris Melikov was intended to cover the government's retreat towards out-and-out reaction. More than once Ignatieff proved himself a demagogue and deceiver of the worst type, so much so that Witte reveals in his memorandum not a little police complacency when he describes the period of his office as an unsuccessful attempt to create a country with local self-government and with an autocratic czar at its head. True, this is precisely the formula advanced at the time by I.S. Aksakov. It was utilized by the government for its maneuvers and was assailed by Katkov, who proved conclusively that there is a necessary connection between local self-government and a constitution. But it would be short-sighted to attempt to explain the well-known tactics of the police government, tactics deriving from its very nature by the prevalence of this or that political view at the given moment. Ignatieff issued a circular, in which he promised that the government would take urgent measures to introduce proper methods to secure, with the maximum of success, the active participation of local public figures in the execution of His Majesty's designs. The Zemstvos responded to this call by petitions pleading for the convocation of an assembly of the elected representatives of the people. From the memorandum of a member of the Cherepovets Zemstvo, the governor did not even permit the opinion of a member of the Kirillov Zemstvo to be published. The government instructed the governors to take no further action with regard to these petitions. At the same time, measures were apparently taken to prevent other assemblies from submitting similar petitions. The notorious attempt was made to call a conference of qualified people handpicked by the ministers, for the purpose of discussing questions of reducing land redemption payments, 43, regulating migration, reforming local government, etc. The work of the committees of experts evoked no sympathy among the public and, notwithstanding all the precautionary measures, even aroused a direct protest from the Zemstvos. 12 Zemstvo assemblies petitioned that Zemstvo representatives be invited to participate in legislative activity, not only on special occasions and by appointment from the government, but permanently and by election from the Zemstvos. An attempt by the Samara Zemstvo to adopt a similar motion was prevented by the chairman, after which the assembly broke up in protest. Dragomanov, Op. Cit. p. 29. Memorandum, p. 131. That Count Ignatiev duped the Zemstvos is apparent from the following fact. Mr. Ustimovich, Marshal of the Poltava nobility and author of the draft constitutional petition of 1879, openly declared in the Gubernia Assembly of Nobles that he had received positive assurances, from Count Ignatiev that the government would call upon the representatives of the country to take part in legislative activity. Dragomanov, Ibid. These frauds of Ignatiev crowned the work of covering up the government's transition to a decisively new policy, and not without good reason. Didier Tolstoy, who on May 30, 1882, was appointed Minister of the Interior, earned the nickname Minister of Struggle. Petitions from the Zemstvos even for the convening of some sort of private conferences were unceremoniously rejected. There was even a case of a government commission replacing the Zemstvo board and banishing its members, on a complaint lodged by a governor against the systematic opposition of the Zemstvo of Cherepovets. D.A. Tolstoy, a faithful disciple and follower of Katkov, went further and decided to reform the Zemstvo institutions. The idea underlying the reform, which, as we have seen, was confirmed by history, was that the opposition to the government has strongly entrenched itself in the Zemstvos. p. 139 of the memorandum, dealing with the original plan for Zemstvo reform. D.A. Tolstoy planned to replace the Zemstvo boards with bureaus subordinated to the governor and to make all decisions of the Zemstvo assemblies subject to the governor's sanction. This would have been a truly radical reform, but it is extremely interesting to note that even this disciple of Katkov, this minister of struggle, in the words of the memorandum, did not abandon the usual policy of the Ministry of the Interior towards the Zemstvo institutions. In the draft of his project, Tolstoy did not openly express his idea, actually to abolish the Zemstvos. On the pretext of correctly developing the principle of local self-government, he sought to preserve their external form, but, at the same time, deprive them of all internal substance. This cunning policy of the foxtail was still further supplemented and developed in the Council of State, with the result that the Zemstvo regulations of 1890 proved to be another half-measure in the history of Zemstvo institutions. They did not abolish the Zemstvos, but rendered them featureless and colorless. They did not destroy their character as being representative of all social estates, but they gave them a social estate tinge. They did not convert the Zemstvo institutions into regular organs of the state, but increased the power of the governors over them, and increased the governor's power of veto. The regulations of July 12, 1890, were, in keeping with their author's design, a step in the direction of abolishing the Zemstvo institutions, not a radical reform of Zemstvo local self-government. The memorandum goes on to state that this new half-measure did not remove the opposition to the government. It was, of course, impossible to remove the opposition to a reactionary government by intensifying that reaction, but merely drove certain of its manifestations below the surface. The opposition manifested itself, first, in the fact that certain anti-Zemstvo laws, if one may so term them, met with resistance and were not carried out de facto. It manifested itself, again, in constitutional, or, at all events, constitution-flavored petitions. Thus, the law of June 10, 1893, which tied up the Zemstvo medical service in a tangle of detailed regulations, met with the first-mentioned type of opposition. The Zemstvo institutions put up a strenuous resistance to the Ministry of the Interior, which had to make a retreat. The ministry was compelled to suspend the introduction of new regulations, already drafted, to reserve them for a complete collection of the laws, and to draft a fresh proposal on altogether different principles, i.e., principles more acceptable to the Zemstvos. The Assessment of Real Estate Act of June 8, 1893, which similarly introduced the principle of regulation and restricted the rights of the Zemstvos in the assessment of rates, likewise gave rise to dissatisfaction, and in many cases, is not being applied in practice. The medical and statistical institutions established by the Zemstvos, which have brought considerable benefit to the population, as compared with the bureaucracy, of course, prove themselves of sufficient strength to paralyze the regulations drawn up in the chancelleries of St. Petersburg. The second form of opposition also found expression in the new Zemstvo, in 1894, when the Zemstvo petitions to Nicholas II renewed very definitely their demand for the extension of local self-government and gave rise to the celebrated words about senseless dreaming. To the horror of the ministers, the political tendencies of the Zemstvos did not disappear. The author of the memorandum cites the bitter complaints of the governor of Tver, from his report of 1898 over the closely knit group of people of liberal views which had concentrated the affairs of the gubernia Zemstvo entirely in its own hands. From the same governor's report for 1895, it is apparent that the struggle against the Zemstvo opposition presents a difficult task for the local administration and that the marshals of the nobility, who officiate as chairmen at Zemstvo meetings, are sometimes called upon to display civic courage, in carrying out the instructions contained in the confidential circulars of the Ministry of the Interior on matters in which the Zemstvo institutions must not interfere. It is further related how, at one of the meetings of the Assembly, the gubernia marshal of the nobility turned over his post as chairman to the Ueizd, see footnote to p. 36. Tr. Marshal, Tver, how the Tver marshal in his turn passed it on to the Novi Torzhok marshal, and how the Novi Torzhok marshal also fell ill and handed over the post to the Staritsa marshal. And so, even the marshals of the nobility flinch from carrying out police functions. The law of 1890, laments the author of the memorandum, gave the Zemstvo a socialist tinge, strengthened the government element in the assemblies, and appointed all the Ueizd marshals of the nobility and rural superintendents, 44, to the gubernia Zemstvo assemblies. And the fact that these featureless, socialist bureaucratic Zemstvos continue nevertheless to betray political tendencies, is a matter that should be pondered. Resistance has not been overcome, deep discontent and silent opposition undoubtedly exist, and will continue to exist until the Zemstvo representing all estates dies. Such is the last word in bureaucratic wisdom. If curtailed representation gives rise to discontent, then the abolition of every kind of representation will, by simple human logic, strengthen this discontent and opposition. Mr. Witte imagines, however, that if one of the institutions that bring at least a particle of discontent to the surface is closed down, the discontent will disappear. Perhaps you'd think that Witte proposes something as resolute as the abolition of the Zemstvo? Nothing of the kind. Although, for the sake of fine words, he condemns the policy of evasion, Witte himself has nothing else but this policy to propose, nor can he have, without shedding the skin of minister of the autocratic government. Witte mumbles errant nonsense about a third way, neither bureaucratic domination nor local self-government, but an administrative reform which should properly organize the participation of public elements in government institutions. It is easy to admit nonsense of this kind, but after all the experiments with qualified people, no one will be deceived by it. It is only too obvious that without a constitution any participation of public elements will be a fiction, will mean the subordination of the public, or those called from the public to the bureaucracy. While criticizing a particular measure of the Ministry of the Interior, the establishment of Zemstvos in the outlying regions, Witte cannot suggest anything new on the general question he himself raises, but merely warms up the old methods, half-measures, pseudo-concessions, and promises of numerous benefits, none of which are fulfilled. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that on the general question of the direction of domestic policy, Witte and Goromykin are at one, and that the controversy between them is merely a family quarrel, a feud within the clan. On the one hand, Witte hastens to declare, "I have never proposed nor do I now propose the abolition of Zemstvo institutions or any radical change in the present system. Under present conditions there can hardly be any talk of abolishing them, the existing Zemstvos." Witte, on his part, thinks that with the establishment of strong governmental authority in the localities, it will be possible to place greater confidence in the Zemstvos, etc. After establishing a strong local bureaucracy to counterbalance local self-government, i.e., rendering local self-government impotent, one can place greater confidence in it. The same old song. Mr. Witte fears only institutions representing all the social estates. He did not have in mind the various corporations, societies, unions of the social estates or trade unions, and did not consider their activities to be dangerous to the autocracy. For example, in regard to the village communes, Mr. Witte does not doubt in the least that in view of their inertness they are harmless to the autocracy. The predominance of landownership relations and the interests connected with them develop spiritual peculiarities in the rural population which render it indifferent to anything outside the politics of the village pomp. Our peasants at village meetings concern themselves with the apportioning of taxes, the distribution of allotments, etc. Moreover, they are illiterate or semi-literate. What sort of politics then can they concern themselves with? Mr. Witte is extremely sober-minded, as you see. In regard to the unions of social estates, he declares that from the point of view of the danger they represent to the central government, their diversity of interests is of great importance. The government, by taking advantage of this diversity of interests, can always find support in one social estate and play it off against the political claims of the others. Witte's program of properly organized participation of public elements in government institutions is nothing but another of the innumerable attempts of the police state to split the population. On the other hand, Mr. Goromykin, with whom Mr. Witte enters into such heated controversy, himself carries out this very systematic policy of disunity and persecution. He argues, in his memorandum, to which Witte rejoins that it is necessary to institute new offices to supervise the Zemstvo. He is opposed to permitting even simple local congresses of Zemstvo civil servants. He stands wholeheartedly for the regulations of 1890, that step towards the abolition of the Zemstvos. He fears the effort of the Zemstvos to include tendentious questions in their program of assessment work. He fears Zemstvo statistics generally. He is in favor of taking the elementary schools out of the hands of the Zemstvos and placing them under the control of government institutions. He argues that the Zemstvos are incapable of handling the questions connected with the food supply. Zemstvo workers, don't you see, encourage exaggerated notions of the extent of the disaster and the needs of the famine-stricken population. And he defends the fixing of limits to Zemstvo taxation, in order to protect landed property from excessive increases in Zemstvo taxes. Witte is entirely right, therefore, when he says, "The entire policy of the Ministry of the Interior towards the Zemstvos consists in slowly but steadily undermining their organs, weakening their significance, and concentrating their functions in the hands of government institutions." It may be said without the slightest exaggeration that when the recently adopted measures referred to in the memorandum, Goromykin's regulating the various branches of Zemstvo work and administration are brought to a successful conclusion, we shall have no local self-government whatever. All that will be left of the Zemstvo institutions will be a mere idea and a shell without any real content. Consequently, the policy of Goromykin, and more so the policy of Sipyagin and of Witte, lead to the same goal, and the controversy over the question of the Zemstvo and constitutionalism is, we repeat, nothing more than a family quarrel. Lovers' tiffs are easily made up again. The fight between Mr. Witte and Mr. Goromykin is nothing more serious than that. As for our own views on the general question of the autocracy and the Zemstvos, it will be more convenient to present them in the process of analyzing the preface written by RNS 16,